Hi, my name is Kelgore, and today we are going to be talking about nonprofit organizations. We all love nonprofits, right? After all, they do the most good. So then why is the title of the video about how I strongly dislike nonprofits? Well, it's because they're the worst. That's why. Look, I'm not here to make a video about those 501c3 organizations that pay their executives $800,000 a year plus bonuses, nor am I talking about the kind of discriminatory behavior many tax-exempt religious organizations display. No, I'm talking about the root of the problem, from which all of those other problems stem. At the root of the nonprofit industry is the reality of all our society's many deficiencies. I do not like the nonprofit industrial complex. I don't like to spend a lot of time on disclaimers, but before you start to feel defensive, let me just say this. If you work for, donate to, volunteer at, or even operate your own nonprofit, I am not saying that you're a bad person. In my experience, the people who end up working in the industry do so because they want to find meaning in their work, they're compassionate individuals, and they want to make a difference in the world. In fact, nonprofit employees, caseworkers, directors, board members, donors are the exact people who I hope to reach with this video, so please hear me out. This is not an attack on you personally, but a critique of the system in which you operate. Another quick note before we get started is that I'm speaking from an American viewpoint. Nonprofits might be called NGOs where you live, and a lot of the specific issues I bring up today might not apply to your country. So let's start at the beginning. What is a nonprofit organization? When I say nonprofit, I'm referring to 501c3 tax-exempt organizations. Most of these fall under the category of being a charity, a foundation, a church, a community group. It could be anything from the NRA to Girl Scouts, from an AIDS foundation to the Westboro Baptist Church. These organizations are exempt from paying taxes, and in some cases, giving money to them counts as a tax write-off for you. It's important to note that they are limited in how much partisan political activity and lobbying they can participate in. So is this really a large enough sector to be called the nonprofit industrial complex? Well, considering that 1 in 10 jobs in America's private workforce is within a nonprofit organization, I would say yes. Yes, it is. Now, has this sort of thing always existed? Charity is as old as time, but if we are talking about tax-exempt organizations in the US, it's a much shorter history. The oldest sort of example would be giving to the church or the church giving back to the community. Charitable giving was mostly a small, well-meaning part of society until people figured out that they could exploit it. It really grew after the whole robber baron era. After the Industrial Revolution, certain men in America were making more money than they knew what to do with. I mean, we're talking Rockefeller money, because we're talking about Rockefeller and Carnegie. So, what are they going to do? Give $100,000 to a local library? I mean, sure, so long as you name it after them. But why do that when they can just set up a foundation or a dozen foundations? So what is a foundation and how is it different than a nonprofit? Okay, I promise we will get into the whole nonprofit thing really soon, but it's really important to understand what foundations are because, in my opinion, this is where it all stems from. In the first decade or so of the 1900s, foundations became a way to organize philanthropy, a way to hold a lot of money in a tax-exempt space for the purpose of redistributing it to the communities and people as needed, especially like during the Great Depression, the 1930s. But then, after World War II, income tax on the rich went up really high, and foundations became a popular way to shelter money from the IRS, which is why they're known as tax shelters. This became a well-known secret among wealthy families who began to hold their fortunes in a foundation rather than in taxable investments and savings. Despite the fact that some regulations were put on this, I think Truman really disliked this whole thing. He tried to regulate it. Pretty much everyone knew that the feds had no way to enforce these regulations. Classic, right? So this went on from about 1945 until 1969, when the tax code was changed and our current system was formed. We basically got two types of foundations, community and private. A community foundation was pretty much classified just like a nonprofit. They're expected to collect money and then create gifts and grants for the local municipality. And the foundation is run by a board, which is like community members and leaders. However, we don't really care about those types of foundations. Private foundations are where shit gets really awful. A private foundation usually has one main source of funding. For example, the Carnegie Foundation, Carnegie Hall. The Carnegie Foundation began with a $1 million donation from, you guessed it, Andy himself. Usually private foundations are governed by a board of family members or people who have a stake in the assets. For example, if there was a Salesforce Foundation, it would probably be governed by a board made up of stakeholders and Salesforce leaders. Think of foundation work as like a little extracurricular activity for extroverted rich people. However, unlike regular nonprofits, none of the money has to come from fundraising. And 5% of the assets have to be paid out every year. Wait, what does that mean? Well, since 1969, it means 5% of the entire foundation's endowment has to be spent each year. In other words, if a billionaire sets aside $100 million to start a foundation in his name, the foundation has to spend $5 million of that $100 million that year to keep their tax-exempt status. Now, he could spend it on many things, such as grant making for other nonprofits, community giving like building a library, or yes, accounting and operating expenses for the foundation itself. Another thing he could do is he could take that 5% he's supposed to spend every year and give it to a nonprofit that he also started. So basically, millionaires and billionaires don't pay taxes. They just keep their money sheltered in a foundation and lose about 5% of the value each year. So they spend 5% on pretty much whatever they want, are seen as little philanthropic heroes, and avoid paying taxes that benefit their municipality, state, and federal government as a result. The other 95% of their foundation can go to themselves, to their family, or they can just invest it and turn it into even more money. Are you starting to see why I hate this shit so much? Do you work for a nonprofit? And do you hear about this foundation that pays you every year? Does it anger you to know that while you guys are scrambling for resources and begging for donor money, the foundation that funds you is likely sitting on the other 95% of its assets? And meanwhile, all of the hard work you do every day is reflected upon the good name of your foundational overlord. So now that we know about foundations, what was I talking about before this? We were talking about how the robber baron types began using foundations to shelter their vast wealth from being taxed and shared among those who need it for the betterment of society. Do you pay taxes, or do you get to shelter your income and wealth to avoid taxes? I bet you pay taxes. And one of the biggest issues in America is that the burden of the public good, like your city's budget, comes from poor and middle-class folks and not from those who have wealth that exceeds the needs of any human on earth. And it's all 100% legal, thanks to the Dog Shit Tax Act of 1969. Talking to me? Like I said before, we have all these wealthy families creating foundations, and since 1969, it mandates that 5% of assets must be paid out each year. And since one of the things you can do with that 5% is donate to a nonprofit, why not start one of those too? So we see the explosion of nonprofit organizations. Now, I promise we are almost done with the history portion of this video, but this is where it gets really bad. Enter Ronald Reagan. Now, Ronald Reagan is not the source of all our problems, but some of the biggest issues plaguing our society can be traced back to his administration. If you are a fan of Reagan, I can only assume it's either because you don't realize what he's responsible for doing, or you're a really bad person. Seriously, if you are aware of everything that he took from us, and you still love the guy, just go ahead and click off this video, because the rest of it is basically a posthumous roast of this evil bastard. I could do a whole video series on him, but I'm going to try to keep this part of the video succinct and focus just on how he changed the status of nonprofits in America. The US was already in a lot of trouble before Reagan became president, but it was upon his inauguration that a gaping void of compassion within our government was created. While there's no rule stating that a nonprofit has to be all kisses and rainbows, there is an expectation that each 501c3 has a mission for the betterment of society, even though that's subjective. In general, these organizations relate to physical and mental health, hunger, addiction, education, the environment. Just think about those things for a minute. Physical and mental health, hunger, addiction, education, the environment. In my opinion, any self-respecting governmental body would do its best to take care of those issues, sort of as a minimum expectation, right? Not letting people be harmed, die of hunger, etc. Especially if your country has a larger GDP than any other country on Earth. Instead, our government likes to focus on issues that don't really require that compassionate touch and likes to leave those very important things up to nonprofits. Now, this was worsened when Reagan gutted the United States social services programs like mental hospitals and welfare, while cutting taxes on the rich and starting the famous war on drugs, institutionalizing millions of nonviolent drug offenders and exploiting them for prison labor, which again is a whole nother video topic. So, when social services get cut and the rich get richer, what happens to the poor? Well, that's exactly where nonprofits come in. Reagan basically created the perfect economy for nonprofits to exist. And by creating a deficit of aid from the government, people began to rely on charities just to get by. Many nonprofits have caseworkers or social workers who are beautiful little angels that spend a huge majority of their time helping clients fill out means testing paperwork for government aid programs like Medicaid and disability. Instead of just awarding that aid to the people who ask for it and need it, they have to prove how poor and disabled they are, usually with the help of a social worker, usually through a nonprofit. Now, why would a city government help a disabled citizen when they can just outsource that work to a nonprofit in the private sector and throw them a little tax exemption to aid in the process? I mean, what did Ronald Reagan love more than anything? Privatization and capitalism, baby. Why let charities run like a little socialist side gig when they can instead be forced to run like a business? And it's not business without a little stiff competition, right? So, to make sure that each of these charities was running like a business, he reduced the amount of federal aid via grants that nonprofits could collect. This was his way of limiting big government, except when it came to the defense budget. Now, instead of 10 charities vying for 5 grants from the federal government, thousands could compete for 1. So this forced organizations to focus more on fundraising, which meant that the nonprofit now needed a whole employee or department solely focused on bringing money in. And what better way to get the word out than with a little whole entire marketing department? Sound familiar? Well, Each nonprofit had to run like a business, and in my humble opinion, nothing should run like a business. I could seriously talk about everything else Reagan did that sucked, like how instead of continuing to give grants to schools and college students, he switched to the beloved education loan program. Yeah, that was Reagan too.
And if I had a gun with 2 bullets and I was in a room with Hitler, Bin Laden,
and Reagan,
I would shoot
Reagan
twice.
But in the interest of keeping this video somewhat brief, let's move on to what nonprofits do today. So, as we were saying, nonprofits began to resemble traditional private businesses. Now, the structure is even the same, with a director instead of a CEO, hovering over a few different program managers, and the underlings below them. But instead of the director being at the top of the pyramid, really, it's the board of directors at the top. Oh wait, that's identical to corporate businesses too. Okay, well, so what is the board of directors for a nonprofit? Well, basically, it's a group of people who have to buy in to being in a leadership position of the nonprofit, and they get to vote and make decisions about the allocation of resources within the business. I mean within the nonprofit. Once again, I want to address those of you who work in the industry. Are the members of your board of directors involved in the daily operations? Do they know what goes on, or do they just come in for photo ops? Do you wish that Martha in advertising didn't get 25% of the budget, and that money could instead go directly to services? Don't you wish that Jacob didn't have to spend all day schmoozing donors and picking out invitation cardstock for the big Festa de la Noche fundraising dinner, and instead could focus on helping the community with you? Now let's take it a step further. Do you ever wish that your local or state government would simply take care of the problem that your organization aims to address? More on that in a minute. So what do nonprofits do anyways? Well, there's a huge variety of services a nonprofit could provide, but I have one basic distinguishing factor. Is it a Band-Aid organization? Now, in my own terms, a Band-Aid organization is a group that treats a never-ending problem. Now, what they're doing is they're taking that gaping wound that the government created in our society, and they're slapping on a fresh Band-Aid every morning. Now, I made that sound like a bad thing, but these are usually some of the most compassionate people in the industry. For example, homeless services. For every unhoused person that a nonprofit feeds or houses, another one shows up. At the end of the day, there's still just as big of a housing problem as there was the day before, right? At the end of the day, there's still just as much of a poverty problem as there was the day before, despite compassionate people showing up every single day to try to help. Now, the opposite of a Band-Aid organization would be something like an educational campaign. So an organization that educates kids about seatbelt safety. Boom, done. So, should the government house people and teach them about seatbelt safety? Yes. Yes, they should do both of those things. But a small private organization can do an effective job at one, but not for the other. So, while a nonprofit could teach you the dangers of driving without a seatbelt, the exact same type of organization cannot exist within a broken system to effectively treat homelessness that plagues every American city. Yet, they are treated the exact same. The government is the only body that is capable of fixing the actual problem, but it refuses to do so. And in the meantime, small private organizations try to do their best to help people every day. However, by doing this, they also allow the government to shirk the responsibility of doing anything at all, and instead point to the nonprofit sector as their solution to the problem. The government is helping the homeless by not taxing those organizations. Instead, they should be taxing millionaires and billionaires to use the money and end homelessness immediately, because it is possible to do so. Getting a little heated. You think of certain things as like government services, right? Like We should have high-speed rail in the Bay Area, where I live. But you wouldn't leave that up to a nonprofit, right? So why is something like homelessness left up to dozens and dozens of nonprofits in the city? The other thing is that if nonprofits were capable of fixing the actual problem, don't you think that some of the 1.5 million nonprofit organizations in the US would have succeeded by now? That is one nonprofit for every 250 people of all ages. Every baby, every old man, everyone in between. That is one nonprofit organization for every 250 people. Huh? Think about it. Have the problems in our society gotten better, worse, or stayed the same? I think it's not working. But Kelgore, how can so many different groups be committed to helping and just not be effective? Well, this is one thing that should be talked about more. Can I affect change from within my organization? Okay, say you've worked at the homeless advocacy group for a year and you're beginning to feel burned out. Every day you show up and you see that all the hard work you do only helps people for a couple days or in a short-term sense, and that they aren't any better off than they were a year ago, despite everyone's efforts. And honestly, you're becoming a little bit radicalized by what you've seen and learned. So what can you do? Well, there are some pretty fucked up rules about nonprofits and politics. Once a nonprofit is established, it is possible for them to lose their tax-exempt status, which is basically a death sentence for an organization. One of the ways a group can lose its status is by becoming overly involved in politics. The rule states that they can't become involved in partisan politics, but that they can advocate. So they can't endorse a politician or a certain party, but they can maybe try to get their local government to pass an ordinance, right? Not exactly. One of the rules, which is pretty vague in my opinion, is that lobbying cannot be a significant part of a group's activity. Now, what does lobbying include? According to the IRS, it means contacting decision makers about a specific piece of legislation and pretty much like asking them to vote one way or the other. So no, they can't really advocate for that new city ordinance, can they? Not really directly. Okay, I know there are a lot of good reasons to keep nonprofits separate from political campaigns, but it really seems like what this rule does is keep nonprofits from affecting actual governmental change, right? If your organization can't campaign or lobby for the law to change, then you just have to stay on that treadmill where every day the problem you try to treat is just as bad as it was the day before. Now, nonprofits aren't the problem. They're just a symptom of the problem. I know this is all really frustrating, and maybe you already knew all this. I mean, I've watched some really great videos on this topic, and I'll link those below, but I just feel like not enough people talk about this. Maybe you didn't know some of this, and you're feeling skeptical or angry that I'm shedding a negative light on charitable organizations. So what can we do? Maybe you volunteer at a food pantry every weekend since the pandemic started. Maybe you're a longtime volunteer at a dog shelter. Are you a caseworker at a nonprofit? Are you thinking of maybe starting your own organization to try to help people? Do you donate to as many charities as you can to help change the world? If so, take heart in the fact that you've probably already done more for your fellow man than most government officials will do in their lifetime appointments. I applaud you for being kind-hearted and altruistic, but maybe some of the stuff I've said today has you feeling a bit nihilistic about the whole thing. But there is something you can do. Vote! Go vote! Totally kidding. You also could pressure the nonprofit that you're associated with to change, but why would they do that? They get tax exemption, they get a job, they get their social status as a, philanthropist. So why would they change? What's in it for them? Not to sound insanely cynical, but if tomorrow they discovered a magical cure for cancer, there would be thousands and thousands of nonprofits that would just immediately be forced to close. So does ending the problem really benefit them? So instead of wasting your time trying to get the government or the nonprofit industrial complex to want to change, you can do your part to shrink the nonprofit industry. I know it sounds stupid because you're just one person, but really, in 2016, the total assets of all nonprofits was about $6 trillion. If you divide that between the roughly 350 million people in America, that's 17 grand just that year per person. Now, I know that the math doesn't really add up that way, and if it was all taxed, it wouldn't necessarily equal 17 grand each, but that $6 trillion in assets was 30% higher than it had been 10 years earlier in 2006. The industry is growing rapidly, especially since Reagan, and I genuinely believe that nonprofits only help in the short-term sense. Think about if the government had spent an extra $17K just on you in 2016. Maybe for your health care or education, or maybe just to make the city and state you live in nicer. Nonprofits are wildly inefficient ways to help people. Some, don't get me wrong, some are very simple, like bail funds. During the BLM protests, there were a lot of these bail funds where you could donate money, and without losing a dime, they would send that money directly to bailing out the activists, spending the night in jail, awaiting trial, etc. It's super simple, but that's not the way that most nonprofits operate. If you have time to volunteer or money to spare, don't give it to a nonprofit. Instead, find a mutual aid group in your area that just directly helps people. It could be a group of 10 people or thousands, but whatever it is, I bet you $6 trillion that you are doing more good than the average member of a nonprofit board of directors does for their community. Seriously, find mutual groups on social media or just help people. Ask your friends if they need a hand. Give a homeless person a hot meal. Sweep the sidewalk outside your house. Make educational content. Donate to your friends' GoFundMe. If you have a grown-up job like a lawyer, go do pro bono work for working class families. If you're an accountant, help your friends set up a foundation in their name so they can avoid paying taxes. Okay, I'm just kidding. But seriously, people need your help, and it's time to cut out the middleman when it comes to just doing good. Instead of just giving money to a nonprofit so that they can hopefully help people, just go help people yourself. Become more connected with your community. Start a mutual aid program. Don't turn it into a nonprofit. I'm not telling you should leave your job at a nonprofit, especially right now, but think about it. Think about if there's a little cognitive dissonance between you and your job, right? Wherever you can, just help the people around you directly and avoid the nonprofit industrial complex altogether, because the stronger and the bigger it grows, the less and less our government feels pressured to do what it is supposed to do. So, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe and comment below if you want more content like this, or if you'd rather I just go back to posting dumb, cringy shit where I pretend to be funny. Okay, bye!